You wake up one morning, open your favorite app, and instead of your feed, you get a message asking for your government ID. A few months later, you open your Kindle library, and half your books simply will not open anymore. Same as you, same account, same money already spent, but somehow less access than you had before. This is not a glitch. It is not a bug. It is the direction the entire internet has been quietly moving in. And 2026 is the year it stopped being subtle. Let's start with the first lock, the one on the front door of the internet itself. For most of the internet's history, getting online meant typing a website address and going. No ID required, no age check, no verification. That era is ending fast, and most people have not fully clocked how far it has already gone over. The last 2 years, dozens of states in America passed laws requiring some form of age verification before you can access certain kinds of content. Utah, Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, and roughly half of all US states now have some version of these laws on the books, and more are joining every few months. These laws typically target adult content sites, but the mechanics behind them are spreading into much broader territory. Some states are experimenting with age verification baked directly into devices, not individual websites. Colorado has proposed legislation that would require a device itself to verify your age once, and then broadcast that verified age signal to every app and website you use afterward. On paper, that sounds efficient. In practice, it means your device becomes a permanent gatekeeper sitting between you and the open internet, deciding in real time what you are and are not allowed to see. It is not just America. The United Kingdom's Online Safety Act, which came into force in the summer of 2025, now requires platforms accessible to children to implement what regulators call highly effective age assurance. Enforcement has already produced real fines against companies that fail to comply. The European Union is pushing toward interoperable digital identity tools designed to verify age while, in theory, preserving privacy, though critics remain deeply skeptical about how well that balance will actually hold up once these systems are deployed at scale. Australia went even further, banning anyone under 16 from using certain social media platforms entirely, and by early 2026, the country's regulators reported removing or restricting access for more than 4.7 million accounts based on age alone. Now, a lot of people hear this and think, fine, that only matters if you are a minor trying to access something you should not be accessing anyway, and there is a real, genuine child safety argument behind these laws that deserves acknowledgement. Research has connected early exposure to certain online content with real psychological harm, and lawmakers pushing these bills are not acting in bad faith. But here is the part that gets far less attention in the mainstream conversation. Age verification, no matter how it is technically implemented, requires proving who you are before you are allowed to see something, and proving who you are at scale across an entire population on a routine basis fundamentally changes what anonymity on the internet even means. Privacy-focused companies have been sounding alarms about exactly this. The CEO of Proton, the encrypted email and VPN company, has publicly warned that widespread age verification represents what he called the death of anonymity online. That is a strong phrase, but the mechanics support the concern. Once a website, an app, or worse, an entire device requires identity verification as a condition of access. Every single interaction you have online becomes attached, in some database somewhere, to a verified real-world identity. Even if a company promises not to store that data long-term, promises get broken, databases get hacked, and laws get quietly expanded, years after they were first passed under much narrower justifications. This is exactly why so many people have started reaching for VPNs as a workaround, and lawmakers have noticed. Wisconsin actually introduced a bill that would have explicitly targeted VPN usage as a method of circumventing age verification requirements before ultimately removing that specific provision under public pressure. But the fact that a VPN ban was even seriously proposed tells you where some legislators want this to eventually head. Utah has already passed a law making websites potentially liable when visitors use a VPN to access their content. Read that carefully. The target is shifting from simply verifying age to actively penalizing the tools people use to protect their privacy while doing so. So that is lock number one, the one on the front door. Now let's talk about lock number two, because this is where the story gets personal in an entirely different way. Even once you are inside the internet, verified, logged in, doing everything by the book, there is a very good chance you still do not actually own the digital files you think you paid for. Take Kindle books as the clearest possible example, because Amazon's changes throughout 2025 and into 2026 read almost like a case study in how digital ownership quietly erodes over time. For years, a workflow existed that let people download their purchased Kindle books, strip the digital rights management protection using a tool called Calibra with a plugin known as Dirtim, and keep a permanent personal offline copy of a book they had legitimately paid for. Amazon spent all of 2025 systematically dismantling that workflow. By September 2025, newer Kindle devices received a firmware update using an entirely new encryption scheme that no publicly available tool has been able to crack. By March 2026, Amazon extended that same lockdown to older Kindle hardware that had previously remained vulnerable to the old removal method. Here is the detail that should genuinely bother you. Amazon has openly stated in its own terms that when you buy a Kindle book, are not actually purchasing the book. You are purchasing a license to access it, a license tied permanently to your Amazon account rather than to any device or file you control. If you close that account for any reason, you lose access to every single book in that library instantly, regardless of how much money you spent building it over the years. And starting in the summer of 2026, Amazon shut down the classic Kindle for PC application entirely, forcing users onto a new Windows-only app distributed exclusively through the Microsoft Store, one specifically designed to block the local downloading that made independent backups possible in the first place. To be fair, Amazon did make one meaningful concession. Starting in January 2026, the company began allowing authors to optionally offer fully DRM-free versions of their ebooks in standard EPUB and PDF formats. That is a genuine positive step and worth acknowledging. But here is the catch that barely gets mentioned in the coverage. This option is opt-in, decided entirely by individual authors and publishers, not by readers, and every major publisher, the so-called Big Five, Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Hachette, Macmillan, and Simon & Schuster, continues applying DRM to virtually everything they release, most independent. Self-published authors simply accept whatever default setting Amazon gives them without ever touching it. The result is that the overwhelming majority of the Kindle catalog remains locked, license-based, and revocable, no matter how the individual purchase transaction felt to you as a buyer clicking that orange button. Music and movies tell a nearly identical story, just with different corporate names attached. Apple Music tracks are wrapped in a proprietary DRM system called FairPlay, encoded in a protected format that only plays on authorized Apple devices. Cancel your subscription, and every downloaded song in your library stops working immediately. Even tracks you thought you had permanently saved for offline listening. Streaming platforms across the board, Spotify, Tidal, Amazon Music, all operate under this same fundamental logic. You are renting continued access, not acquiring permanent ownership, no matter how the checkout page phrases it. Video games follow this exact same playbook, sometimes in even more extreme forms, and this corner of the industry rarely gets folded into the broader digital ownership conversation, even though it probably should be front and center. Cloud gaming services store no game files on your device whatsoever. Everything runs on a remote server somewhere, streamed to your screen in real time. That arrangement sounds convenient right up until the service provider decides to shut down, at which point every game you ever played through that platform simply disappears with no local file left behind to salvage. Google Stadia is the textbook example lawyers and journalists keep pointing back to. When Google discontinued Stadia, players lost access to their entire libraries essentially overnight, and depending on the specific game and publisher involved, refunds were inconsistent at best, even traditional, non-cloud-based. Game purchases increasingly rely on persistent online activation systems that phone home to a central server just to confirm you are allowed to keep playing something you already fully paid for. There is a slow but genuinely interesting counter-movement building in response to all of this, and it deserves mention because it complicates the otherwise fairly bleak picture we have been painting. Right to repair legislation, originally focused on physical devices like phones, tractors, and appliances, has started expanding its scope of concern into digital ownership more broadly. Industry analysts tracking the DAR-M landscape have specifically flagged regulatory pressure from right to repair and digital ownership advocates as one of the forces most likely to reshape how locked down these systems can legally become going forward. It is still early, and it is still moving far slower than the corporate side of this equation, but it represents a real organized pushback rather than simply scattered individual complaints on social media. Some platforms have also started experimenting with lighter touch alternatives, sometimes called soft DRM, which use invisible watermarking to trace leaked content back to its source without placing hard restrictions on how many devices you can use or whether the content works offline. It is a meaningfully different philosophy from the hardware-locked, constantly online verification systems dominating platforms like Kindle and Apple Music, and it suggests the industry has not fully settled on one single approach as the permanent standard going forward, whether that softer model spreads more broadly or simply remains a niche alternative used by a handful of smaller content providers will likely depend heavily on how much continued pressure builds from consumers, journalists, and eventually lawmakers over the next few years. It is worth pausing here to trace exactly why companies keep pushing in this particular direction, because understanding the underlying financial logic makes the whole picture click into place. Subscription-based license-controlled access is simply more profitable and more predictable than one-time ownership ever was. A customer who buys a physical book once generates a single, finite payment. A customer locked into a recurring subscription or a license that can be quietly modified or restricted after the fact generates ongoing, adjustable revenue that companies can optimize indefinitely. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is publicly stated corporate strategy, discussed openly on earnings calls, in investor presentations, and in the strategic roadmaps companies publish for shareholders. Digital ownership, from a purely financial perspective, was never going to remain as generous or permanent as the physical ownership model it gradually replaced, because permanent ownership caps how much revenue a single customer can ever generate. The identity verification side of this story follows a slightly different, though related, financial logic. Once a platform has verified persistent identity data tied to your account, that data itself becomes valuable both for targeted advertising and for building detailed behavioral profiles that extend far beyond simply confirming you meet a minimum age requirement. Privacy researchers have repeatedly pointed out that age verification systems, even ones built with genuinely good intentions, tend to accumulate far more personal data than the narrow legal requirement technically demands, because collecting extra data is cheap, storage is cheap, and the potential future value of that data to the company collecting it is very rarely zero. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we cover stories exactly like this every single week, connecting the dots most channels leave scattered. By 2026, the technical sophistication behind this lockdown has genuinely escalated to a new level, and it is worth understanding exactly how, because the old tricks that used to work simply do not anymore. Modern DAR-M systems increasingly rely on something called a trusted execution environment, a secure, isolated section of your device's processor where decryption happens completely out of reach of your operating system. Your computer, even with full administrator access, literally cannot see the raw, unencrypted data as it passes through. On top of that, secure video paths keep content encrypted all the way from the server to your actual screen pixels, and dynamic licensing systems issue keys that expire within minutes, forcing constant check-ins with a remote server just to keep something playing, even if someone manages to capture content anyway. Forensic watermarking embeds invisible, account-specific identifiers directly into the audio or video itself, so leaked content can be traced straight back to the original purchasing account. Layer that technical reality on top of the access restrictions we just walked through, and a much bigger pattern starts to come into focus. It is not just that individual companies are being greedy or overly protective of their intellectual property, though that is certainly part of it. It is that two entirely separate forces, government regulation aimed at protecting minors and corporate strategy aimed at maximizing recurring revenue and minimizing piracy, are independently pushing in the exact same direction. Less anonymous access, less permanent ownership, more centralized control sitting above the individual user, whether that user is a curious teenager or a paying adult customer who simply wants to keep the book they bought. There is a legitimate counter-argument here, and it deserves real airtime rather than a dismissive mention. Publishers, studios, and platforms have genuine, defensible reasons for protecting their content from unauthorized copying and mass piracy. Creative work takes enormous time and money to produce, and completely unrestricted, unprotected digital distribution has historically led to devastating revenue losses across the music and publishing industries. DRM did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged directly in response to real, well-documented piracy problems that genuinely hurt working artists and authors, not just faceless media conglomerates sitting comfortably at the top. Similarly, the child safety motivations behind age verification laws are not manufactured or cynical talking points invented purely to justify surveillance infrastructure. Parents, pediatricians, and researchers have raised serious, legitimate concerns about how various forms of harmful online content and addictive platform design genuinely affect developing minds. Lawmakers responding to that pressure are, in the vast majority of cases, acting on real constituent concern rather than some coordinated hidden agenda to eliminate anonymous internet access altogether. But intention and consequence are two very different things, and this is exactly where the honest, uncomfortable middle ground of this entire story actually lives. Even well-intentioned age verification infrastructure creates exactly the kind of permanent, centralized identity checkpoint that becomes far more dangerous the moment it gets repurposed, expanded, or breached down the line. And even legitimate anti-piracy DRM technology, once perfected and hardware locked to this degree, quietly strips away the basic first sale rights that physical media buyers have taken completely for granted for generations. You could always lend a physical book to a friend. You could always resell a used CD, sufficiently locked down digital. Licenses eliminate both of those long-standing freedoms almost entirely, and most consumers never explicitly agreed to that trade-off. They just clicked accept on a terms of service document nobody actually reads. What makes 2026 specifically feel like a turning point rather than simply more of the same slow drift is the sheer speed and scale at which both of these trends accelerated within a single calendar year. Age verification law counts roughly doubled across just the past 18 months. Kindle DRM removal methods that had reliably worked for over a decade got completely dismantled within a single 12-month stretch. Device-level age verification, something that would have sounded like paranoid speculation just a few years ago, is now sitting inactive, serious legislative proposals in multiple states simultaneously. When multiple independent trends accelerate at the same time, in the same general direction, that pattern is usually worth paying close attention to, regardless of which side of these individual debates you personally land on. So what can you actually do about any of this, practically speaking, right now? For file ownership specifically, buying DAR-M-free formats whenever platforms genuinely offer that option, and physically backing up personal files the moment you download them rather than assuming permanent cloud access, meaningfully reduces your exposure to sudden, one-sided policy changes down the line for online access and privacy. More broadly, understanding exactly which verification methods a given platform actually uses and reading the specific data retention policies attached to them at least lets you make an informed choice rather than an accidental one buried inside a lengthy terms of service update you never actually read. There is also an international dimension worth including because this is not purely an American story, even though a lot of the loudest coverage happens to focus there. Canada introduced its own version of this trend in June 2026 with a proposed Safe Social Media Act that would bar anyone under 16 from regulated platforms nationwide, closely following the same broad, platform-wide model Australia pioneered rather than the narrower, content-specific approach favored by most individual American states. That bill still needs to clear Parliament, and enforcement realistically would not begin until 2027 at the earliest, but it shows the underlying regulatory philosophy spreading well beyond its original borders. The European Union, meanwhile, has separately moved forward with a proposal establishing an EU-wide digital minimum age of 16 for social media, video sharing platforms, and AI companion apps, unless a parent explicitly authorizes earlier access. Watching multiple governments across different continents converge on remarkably similar policy frameworks within the same 18-month window suggests this is not an isolated political trend confined to one country's particular culture war. It looks much more like a coordinated, if informally coordinated, global recalibration of what anonymous internet access is even allowed to mean going forward. None of this is about panic, and it is definitely not about pretending every single company or lawmaker involved here is secretly plotting against you personally. It is about recognizing a genuine structural shift while it is still actively happening, rather than waking up 5 years from now wondering exactly when you lost casual, anonymous access to the open internet, and when the files you paid good money for stopped feeling like something you actually owned. The internet was originally built on an assumption of open, mostly anonymous access, and personal computing was built on an assumption that buying something meant you genuinely owned it afterward. Both of those foundational assumptions are being renegotiated right now, simultaneously, through entirely separate channels that rarely get discussed together in the same conversation. Understanding both halves of that shift, side by side, is exactly how you stay informed enough to make real decisions about your own digital life, instead of simply discovering the new rules the hard way, one locked file and one ID check at a time. If this kind of deep dive into what is really happening beneath the headlines is useful to you, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because these two stories are only going to keep accelerating from here, and we will be tracking every twist as it happens.